The only thing I can say here is cowabunga. Welcome to Same Name, Different Game. My name is Joe, and before you ask, Raphael is my favorite Ninja Turtle. Yes, friends, this May marks the 35th anniversary of everyone's favorite mutated martial arts practicing amphibians into the pop culture zeitgeist. And to celebrate, I'm taking a look at an oft-requested trio of titles, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters. But before we get to the games, let's get started with a little history. If you were born any time after the late 70s, it would seem impossible for you to not know who the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are. But it is possible that you don't know where they came from. Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird were friends living together in New Hampshire in the early 80s. Together they did a few doodles of turtles that were also ninjas, because the idea of a notoriously slow-moving animal being a ninja was hilarious to them. And the idea just wouldn't go away, so in May of 1984 they self-published a comic book about 4 Ninja Turtles that both paid tribute to and made fun of Frank Miller's work on Daredevil and Ronin. This was during an era when there were a lot of black and white indie comics full of violence, and while this book isn't too serious, it is much more violent than what most people think of when they think Ninja Turtles. Also, obviously, this is a reprint, but if you can get your hands on a copy of this book from one of the original run of 3,000, it is worth thousands of dollars. So Eastman and Laird had a pretty successful little indie book. But how did TMNT go from sharing cultural headspace with Reed Fleming, World's Toughest Milkman, to a massive phenomenon? Well, initially it was pretty organic. Each issue of the comic just kept selling better and better, but the real breakthrough came as it so often does, with toys. The short version is that several agents and managers wanted to help Kevin and Peter license their property, but they insisted on keeping it to themselves until one of them got them to give him a chance. Said agent shopped the turtles to the fledgling Playmates Toys, who saw the potential but wanted a cartoon to go with the toys, since the comics were decidedly not for kids. And the rest, as they say, is history. The original Ninja Turtles cartoon debuted in October of 1987, and Leo, Don, Mikey, and Raph have been more or less omnipresent in the pop culture landscape since. They've had, to date, 5 different TV series, 6 theatrical films, at least 3 separate comics continuities under different publishers, more toys than you can shake a sigh at, a concert tour which yours truly attended as a child, and most importantly to us, video games. Lots and lots of video games. It serves to reason. The rise of the Ninja Turtles... No, the actual rise of the property Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles coincided with Nintendo Mania hitting its fever pitch in North America, and once great publisher Konami was responsible for the vast majority of Turtle games for almost 20 years, starting in 1989 with the release of both the original arcade game and the first NES game, all the way up until 2007 when Ubisoft got the license. But none of these games have been more requested by my viewers than Tournament Fighters. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters is arguably Konami's best-known entry into the fighting game craze of the 90s. These games use characters from across the various Ninja Turtle properties, including both Mirage and Archie comics, as well as the original cartoon and, well, almost the movies. We'll talk more about that later. It's a bit of an odd duck, but in its way it's completely emblematic of what was so interesting about games in the 90s and why I started this show in the first place. See, Tournament Fighters isn't one game that was ported to different systems with a variety of quirks. No, it's 3 completely different games, all developed simultaneously, internally, and near as I can tell, released simultaneously in the fall of 1993 by Konami. This practice, of course, wasn't completely unheard of. As I've mentioned before, games like Strider and Ninja Gaiden were developed in parallel for the arcade and NES, resulting in very different experiences. But this is one of the very few games I can think of where the Super NES and Genesis games were developed in parallel and turned out completely different. But let's not get ahead of ourselves with these 16-bit outings. Let's start really digging into these games with Konami's final release on Nintendo's 8-bit juggernaut. Fighting games on NES are pretty few and far between, even if you go the extra mile and count games like Pro Wrestling and Punch-Out!, which, for the record, I do not. Even then, there's still only a handful, and arguably the best one, Joy Mecha Fight, never left Japan. And looking at this attempt by one of the best developers of the era tells you exactly why. It's just not great. I mean, it's not awful, but look at the limited roster and the amount of sprite flicker going on here, and the hardware is being pushed to its limits. This game has a smaller roster than the original Street Fighter II. In fact, when you're playing 2-player mode, you're allowed to choose the same character, unless that character is Hothead. You apparently can force this using a Game Genie, but supposedly the game can crash because 2 Hotheads is too much for the humble NES. Which brings up a point that I'll be coming back to as we move on. Each of these games has a different roster, and besides the Turtles themselves, only Casey Jones, Shredder, and Karai appear in more than one game, and the 3 of them are not in any one game together. The NES version features the Turtles, Casey, and Hothead, who apparently is correctly named Warrior Dragon, and is a character from the Archie comics continuity, and then Shredder. In the single-player mode, only the Turtles are selectable. First you defeat your brothers, then you go on to hone your skills against allies Casey and Hothead before fighting the Shredder, who is ridiculously overpowered. As with all the games we're talking about today, continues are limited, which isn't something that I love in any game, but especially a fighting game. It makes defeating Shredder pretty tough. Your moves are limited, and the Turtles themselves share a lot of moves because they don't get their weapons in this game. Seems like turtle blasphemy, right? But it's true, and I strongly suspect it was to save cart space by literally having all 4 turtle sprites just be slight palette swaps. There's a mechanic with Splinter sending a drone that drops a ball you can pick up and then shoot as a super move, but mostly this is just a middling 2-button fighter with a small roster and an even smaller selection of stages with only 4. The music is great, keeping with Konami trends of the time, and it honestly looks pretty good for an NES game, but it's obvious that Konami's A-teams had moved on to the Super NES and Genesis, which is exactly what we're going to do after these messages.
Dudes, when battling the foot, my motto is keep your feet planted, except of course when you're in the air. Which brings us to the Turtle Bubble Bomber. Our Bubble Bomber drops smoke-filled bubble bombs. Boom! A really awesome jet with really awesome bombs. And that brings us to another great vehicle, the Sewer Sand Cruiser. Turrets rotate, makes gunfire sounds, that'll get the foot flying. So dudes, remember, a good turtle general never finds himself in the soup.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
I hate soup jokes.
Tamed by success, the turtles lost their savage edge. Greed is dead. It's a new breed carved from the streets. Concrete fists batter alien flesh, one on one, as power joins forces with rage, ripping through fear, and no one sheds a tear for mutilated mutants. Giant warriors crushed by street-tough turtles who have shed soft shells for a hard dose of reality in Konami's Tournament Fighters.
The Genesis game overall feels like a step up from the NES, despite still being a 2-button fighter, which honestly is odd given that the 6-button controller was available by that time. Be that as it may, the game definitely feels more fleshed out. The roster is much bigger and includes 3 unplayable bosses. In this edition, we've got the Turtles, Casey Jones, April actually gets to throw down, and then we've got a couple odd ones. First is Ray Fillet, otherwise known as Man Ray, who is one of the Archie Comics characters. Rounding out the playable roster is Sisyphus, a mutant beetle who seems to be a totally original character just for this game. The aforementioned unplayable bosses are an unnamed Triceraton, followed by Krang. Wow, Krang is here. Except he looks small. I mean, look, I was one of those kids that had the Krang robot body action figure, and he was like twice as tall as the Turtles. I mean massive, like 11 inches or something. And in Konami's own beat-em-ups, he's always way bigger, so why is he like the same size as Raphael here? Well, anyways, the final boss is Karai, who, if you're unawares, was originally from the Mirage comics and takes over the Foot Clan after Shredder. The stories of these games are wildly different, but this one has the most out there story. The NES game just has Shredder pulling the classic fighting game villain move of having a tournament just because. But the Genesis game features the Turtles and friends. Yes, friends, you can actually use the non-Turtles in the story on this one, on a quest to save Splinter from Krang and evil clones of themselves across space and in Dimension X. So each fight is on a different planet somewhere, and while a lot of these stages do look really cool, nothing about this feels like TMNT. No sewers, no rooftops in New York, nothing like that at all. I don't think this was another game at any point in development, but it feels like it started as a different game and had the TMNT stuff added at the 11th hour. Gameplay-wise, it's about what you expect, with a pretty standard suite of special moves, though I will say that while both this and the Super NES game garner a lot of comparisons to Street Fighter, I find they feel a lot more like SNK fighting games of the time, especially because this game has desperation moves that can only be used when your health is in the red. But here's the problem. I said this was a 2-button fighter, and it is, really. But the C button does have 2 functions. Primarily, it taunts. Secondarily, it's the action button for pulling off your desperation moves. Yes, rather than punch and kick together or something else, you use the taunt button for desperation moves, which means if you miss an input, you're wide open for attack. Once again, the game sounds good and looks good, except for Krang. But the fighting feels limited with just 2 buttons. This is the only one of the games without Shredder, and for as cool as some of those stages look, and I do think some of them look super dope, it just doesn't feel like a Turtles game. So with that said, let's go ahead and move on to our final game for this episode, TMNT Tournament Fighters on Super Nintendo. Now this is more like it. Feeling even more like an SNK fighter with a 4-button control scheme using 2 punch or weapon buttons and 2 kick buttons, this version actually has 2 single-player modes with 2 different stories. The first is the actual proper story mode, allowing the use of only the Turtles as they pursue Shredder and Karai across the city to first save April, then Splinter. because like 90% of Turtle games involve saving April, then Splinter. There's also a mode called Tournament, which allows you to choose any character to face off in what April calls the ultimate tournament in the galaxy. The roster this time out is the biggest and most mixed. The Turtles and Shredder, called Cyber Shredder here for some reason, yet outwardly no different from just regular Shredder. But things get a little weird after that. We have War and Armagon from the Archie comics, Wingnut, who first appeared in the cartoon, then the Cereal Box comics, but here resembles his Archie comics incarnation most closely, Chrome Dome from the cartoon, and then Asuka. But who is Asuka, you ask? This is something folks wondered for a long time. She kinda looks like April from the Genesis version, but April gets kidnapped in the story of this game, so maybe Konami just made a brand new character. Well, they would have liked us to think that, but at some point a beta version of this game found its way out, and it appears that Asuka was originally meant to be Mitsu from the third Ninja Turtle movie. So that would mean this game has characters that originated in the original comics from Mirage, the cartoon, the Archie comics, and the film series. The bosses here are Rat King, who you face at the midpoint of the game, and Karai. Unlike the Genesis game, they're both unlockable via a code. Speaking of codes, this one has a few, unlike the other games. There's one for 10 continues in story mode, one to unlock the boss stages in versus mode, and in the Japanese version, a slightly altered version of the Konami code will open a group battle mode. A weirder code will open super moves for the story mode. See, unlike the Genesis game, this one has a meter that fills, like Super Street Fighter II Turbo, but it's gone in the story mode unless you enter this code. That strikes me as odd, but at least there's a way to get them. The graphics and music here are outstanding, with stages that evoke the Turtle cartoon and music that stands up with the fantastic tracks from Turtles in Time on the Super NES. The Kukeha Club still had it. The characters are a wide and varied group, the fighting is fun, and overall, while this isn't exactly Street Fighter II, it's still a lot of fun. And that is all of them, so let's do like we always do, take a look and a listen side by side.
Okay. I've got you now.
Round two. Fight!
The Genesis game uses the full screen resolution and plays at 60 frames per second, while the Super NES version is in this kind of weird letterbox like the NES version, and also only runs at 30 frames per second. But that being said, they both look and sound great, though the brighter colors and stages that feel more like Ninja Turtles make me take the Super NES when it comes to pure aesthetics. And that makes it time to give the edge. And honestly, it is no contest for me on this one. The Super NES is the definitive, version of Tournament Fighters. It has the biggest roster, it has playable bosses, it has the most complex fighting system with 4 attack buttons, and it has an awesome soundtrack, although all of them kind of have that. And the Genesis version is the second best version, which is good because the 16-bit versions are the most affordable. You can expect to pay about $15 for a bare cart of either one of them. The NES version, on the other hand, yikes. It's one of those games, one of those late-era NES games based on a license, which means the prices are ridiculous. Expect to pay at least $150 for a bare cart in the current market, and you're talking several $100s for a boxed copy. So my recommendation is that you do what I did and load it up on your favorite flash card. That does it. Happy 35th birthday, Ninja Turtles. Here's to another 35 years of kick and shell. And hey, make sure to come back next time because I will start celebrating a different anniversary for something else that is great and green. But this time it's a great green piece of gaming hardware. We'll see you then. Hey folks, thanks so much for watching. Please do all the stuff, the liking, the commenting, the subscribing, the ringing of the bell. If you really dug the show, consider helping out on Patreon. You'll help keep the show ad-free and get your name alongside these lovely people. If you want more games based on comics, there's a comic game playlist on the left. And if you want more fighting games, the same name, different game episode on Street Fighter Alpha is on the right.